Are you ready for another round of mind-boggling megaprojects that will leave you scratching your head and wondering, what were they thinking? Well, look no further, because in this video, we're diving into the world's most useless megaprojects, part 3. Number 5. Big Dig. Oh boy, the Big Dig. Let me tell you, it was supposed to be this massive infrastructure project that would transform the city of Boston, but instead, it turned into a giant mess. So, let's dive into why this thing failed so spectacularly. First of all, for those of you who don't know, the Big Dig was a project to bury the Interstate 93 highway that ran through the heart of Boston and replace it with a tunnel. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, not so much. One of the biggest problems with the Big Dig was that it was insanely expensive. I'm talking billions of dollars here. In fact, it ended up being the most expensive highway project in American history. And let's be real, anytime you hear the words most expensive in the same sentence as American history, you know it's not going to end well. But it wasn't just the cost that was the issue. The construction of the tunnel was plagued by all sorts of problems. There were issues like leaks, faulty construction materials, and even a ceiling collapse that tragically killed a woman. Yikes. And don't even get me started on the traffic. The whole point of the Big Dig was to ease traffic congestion in Boston. But during the construction phase, it actually made traffic worse. It was like the city was stuck in a never-ending game of which lane is open today. But the real kicker was that, even after all the time and money that went into the Big Dig, it still didn't solve Boston's traffic problem. In fact, some argue that it actually made things worse in the long run. The Big Dig was an expensive, leaky, and deadly mess that ended up making traffic worse instead of better. But hey, at least it gave us something to complain about during our morning commutes, right? Number 4. Sydney Monorail. The Sydney Monorail was a funky little train that ran in a single loop around the central business district of Sydney, Australia from 1988 to 2013. It was supposed to be a convenient and futuristic way to get around the city, but it turned out to be more of a novelty ride for tourists than a practical mode of transportation. One of the biggest problems with the Sydney Monorail was the route. It covered only 3.6 kilometers, which is about the same distance as a leisurely stroll in the park. To make matters worse, it didn't really connect to any important transportation hubs, so you couldn't use it to get to and from the airport or other must-see locations. It was like trying to build a highway to nowhere, but with way cooler technology. But wait, it gets better. The monorail was plagued with technical issues. It was constantly breaking down, and people were getting stuck mid-journey like it was some sort of terrible amusement park ride. The Sydney Monorail had a history of technical malfunctions and safety concerns. In 1988, an electrical fault left 50 passengers stranded for 2 hours, and emergency services weren't called until much later. In 1992, services were suspended due to a nearby fire. In 2010, 2 monorail trains collided, sending 4 people to the hospital. And in 2012, an underground cable failure led to a complete shutdown of the system, stranding approximately 100 passengers. Overall, it's safe to say the monorail wasn't the most reliable mode of transportation. It's like they took a page from the old Mr. Toad's Wild Ride playbook and thought, hey, this seems like a good idea for public transportation. Of course, the real kicker was that the locals didn't really care for the monorail either. Some thought it was too expensive, while others just found it plain pointless. And can you blame them? And so, in 2013, the government finally pulled the plug on the Sydney Monorail. The monorail was dismantled and sold for scrap, and now it's nothing more than a distant memory of a transportation system that never quite took off. The Sydney Monorail was like the kid who showed up to the party wearing a clown costume. It tried to be cool and futuristic, but it just ended up being awkward and out of place. Number 3. The Kansai International Airport. Some people might call it useless, but I like to think of it as a comedy of errors that just keeps on giving. First of all, let's talk about the location. Who in their right mind builds an airport on a man-made island in the middle of Osaka Bay? Apparently, the engineers behind the Kansai airport thought it was a brilliant idea. But, as it turns out, building an airport on a man-made island is like building a sandcastle at high tide. The island is sinking, and sinking fast. And let's not forget that Japan is prone to earthquakes. That's right, you heard it here first, folks. The Kansai airport is a ticking time bomb. Remember that time in 2018 when the typhoon Jebi hit Japan and flooded the airport? Passengers were stranded for hours, flights were cancelled, and chaos ensued. I can only imagine the scene. people wading through knee-deep water, luggage floating around like life rafts, and airport staff frantically trying to save the electronics. And let's not forget about the price tag. The Kansai airport was supposed to cost around $8 billion, but ended up costing over $20 billion. That's right, $20 billion. And for what? An airport that's sinking, flooding, and in constant need of repairs. If that's not a failure, I don't know what is. But hey, at least the Kansai airport is good for something. It's the perfect example of what not to do when building an airport. So if you ever find yourself in charge of building an airport, just remember, don't build it on a sinking island, and definitely don't spend more than $20 billion on it. You're welcome. Number 2. The Concord supersonic airliner. I like to call it the super duper fast, but not so practical plane. Now, don't get me wrong, the Concord was a marvel of engineering. It could travel at supersonic speeds, which means it could get you from New York to London faster than you could say bangers and mash. But the thing is, it was just too darn expensive to be useful for most people. I mean, if you wanted to fly on the Concord, you had to be willing to pay an arm and a leg. And let's face it, most people would rather keep their limbs and just take a regular old flight. It's amazing how much time, money and effort went into developing this super fast airplane. But you know what they say, you can't put a price on speed, right? Well, apparently you can, because the cost overruns and delays on this thing were astronomical. I mean, they started working on it back in 1954, and it didn't even enter service until 1976. That's over 20 years. I can't even imagine how many cups of coffee those engineers must have gone through during that time. And then there's the cost. The original estimate was £70 million, which was already a lot of money back then. But by the time they were done, the cost had ballooned to between £1.5 to £2.1 billion. That's enough to make Scrooge McDuck blush. But hey, at least they finally got it up in the air, right? And it did cut travel times in half, which is pretty impressive. Too bad it was so loud that it probably woke up every person within a 10-mile radius. In the end, the Concord was just too much of a novelty to be practical. It was like having a Ferrari as your daily driver. Sure, it's flashy and impressive, but it's just not practical for everyday use. Number 1. Super Collider. Let me tell you a little story about a particle accelerator project that could have been the biggest thing since sliced bread, but ended up being more of a flop than a pancake on a hot Texas morning. We're talking about the Superconducting Super Collider, or SSC, a massive machine that was going to be built just outside Waxahachie, Texas. Now, when I say massive, I mean massive. This bad boy was going to take up 87.1 kilometers of real estate. That's like trying to fit the entire state of Rhode Island inside a shopping mall. And get this, it was supposed to bring in up to 8,000 new jobs in the area. That's a whole lot of folks looking for some good old Texas barbecue. But, like a lot of things in life, the SSC had some problems. For starters, the budget was tighter than a cowboy's belt after a big meal. The project never got enough funds, despite foreign governments promising $2.6 billion that never showed up. Even Texas's own government only delivered $400 million out of a promised $900 million. Yikes. You know, it's funny how things can start out with a lot of promise and then just fall flat. The SSC had a ton of support from both the Texas government and local communities when it was first proposed. But once construction began, reality hit, and enthusiasm fell through faster than a snake in a greased pig race. In an interview with Texas Monthly, Roy Schwitters, the former director of the SSC, talked about why the project ultimately failed. By 1992, the Cold War was over. From the end of World War II to then, we had an existential threat from a society that was damn good at science and math. It led to the space program and physics research and education that supported us through grad school. That threat is no longer with us, and society is still deliberating how to deal with that. I don't know about you, but that sounds like some heavy stuff for a project that was supposed to make things go zoom. And that's a wrap, folks. We hope you enjoyed our tour of the world's most useless megaprojects. Just remember, if you ever find yourself with billions of dollars and absolutely nothing better to do, try not to fall into the trap of building a giant ice hotel in the desert or a tunnel to nowhere. But hey, if you do decide to go ahead with it, make sure to invite us for the grand opening. We'll bring the popcorn and a healthy dose of skepticism. See you guys in the next video.